What would you do if your power kept mysteriously cutting out, night after night, but every time you went to investigate, there was no clear explanation? What if, instead of faulty wiring, you found someone standing outside your house, tampering with your breaker box in the dead of night? Ethan Carter had been in his new home for exactly 1 week when the power went out for the 3rd time in a row. At first, he thought it was just one of those quirks of moving into an older neighborhood, a minor inconvenience, a hiccup in the system. The first time, he'd reset the breaker and gone back to watching TV. The second time, he grumbled, wondering if the previous owners had lied about upgrading the wiring. But now it felt personal. Standing in his darkened kitchen, beer in hand, Ethan sighed and reached for the flashlight he'd started keeping on the counter. Silverwood Lake was supposed to be his peaceful getaway, a place where he could fish off his dock, enjoy the quiet, and escape the chaos of city life. Instead, it was starting to feel like he wasn't entirely welcome here. The wind rattled the trees outside, the lake stretching out behind his house, still and quiet. Across the water, a few homes still had their lights on. It wasn't a full neighborhood outage. Just him. That was enough to set off alarm bells. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, pulling on his jacket and stepping outside. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of lake water and pine. His dock extended over the water, freshly cleaned from the pressure wash he'd done that morning, right before he got a letter from the HOA telling him it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. Ethan had already heard plenty about Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, a woman whose entire personality seemed to revolve around the phrase, "as per regulation." She was the self-appointed guardian of property values, the enforcer of lawn heights, and, apparently, his sworn enemy. But an HOA couldn't just cut someone's power, right? That's when he saw him. Standing in the shadows by his electrical meter, a man in a reflective vest was crouched down, a pair of pliers in hand. Ethan's pulse kicked up. His first instinct was to think the guy was with the power company, until he noticed something off. The man wasn't wearing an ID badge. He wasn't even wearing standard gear, just an unmarked vest and a shifty expression. Ethan stepped forward. "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" The man jumped like he'd been caught breaking into a car, his grip tightening around the pliers before quickly stuffing them into his tool belt. He was in his 40s, stocky, his uniform worn and faded, the logo on his chest reading, Silverwood Utility Services, a company Ethan had never heard of. "Oh, hey," the guy stammered. "Just doing a routine check on your electrical connections." "In the middle of the night?" Ethan crossed his arms. "With pliers?" The guy hesitated. "Well, no, standard maintenance." Ethan's eyes narrowed. His gaze dropped to the pliers. The handles were wrapped in electrical tape. A quick fix for an overused tool. This guy wasn't with the power company. He took another step forward. "What exactly are you maintaining?" The man took a slow step back. "Look, buddy, I'm just following orders." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Whose orders?" Before the man could answer, a sharp voice cut through the night. "Excuse me, but what's going on here?" Ethan turned just as Karen Whitmore marched down the sidewalk, arms folded, lips pursed in the same way a teacher looks at a student about to get detention. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, Ethan could see the smugness in her face. And just like that, it all started to make sense. Ethan knew something was wrong the moment he stepped outside the next morning. The air was crisp, the lake calm, but his dock, his freshly built, perfectly legal dock, was covered in spray paint. The words, "No HOA," "No rules," "No respect," dripped in thick red streaks across the wood, the paint still glistening wet in the morning light. He clenched his jaw. Real mature. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the security camera footage from the night before. A hooded figure had crept onto the dock around midnight, shaking a spray can with that familiar metallic rattle before defacing his property. The footage was grainy, but the build and posture were familiar. Ethan's first thought? Karen's nephew, Dylan Whitmore. The kid had the right level of arrogance and the same slouched stance as the figure in the video. But when Ethan zoomed in, he realized it wasn't Dylan. It was someone older. Someone frail. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. Later that morning, he paid a visit to the one person who had every reason to be scared of Karen Whitmore, Mr. Lawson. The elderly man lived 2 streets over in a modest, well-maintained house with a neatly trimmed lawn that was always exactly within HOA regulations. Too perfect. Ethan knocked once, then again. The door cracked open, and Mr. Lawson peered out, his face lined with exhaustion. The moment he saw Ethan, his eyes darted away. Ethan sighed. "You don't have to lie, Mr. Lawson. I have the footage." The man's hands tightened on the doorknob. I'm so sorry. She said if I didn't do it, she'd have my son's house foreclosed." Ethan stiffened. "What?" Mr. Lawson swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder like he was afraid Karen had spies in his own home. "He lost his job last year. Karen, she knows. She said she could find a way to make his house non-compliant and," his voice broke. Ethan inhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm. Karen had bullied an elderly man into vandalizing his property. He clenched his fists. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. When he confronted Karen later that afternoon, she had the audacity to smirk. Arms folded, she leaned against her porch railing, utterly unbothered. "Oh, Ethan," she sighed, shaking her head with mock disappointment. "I had no idea about any of this. But if a fellow resident was so upset about your choices, maybe you should listen." His blood boiled. She wasn't just an HOA tyrant, she was a manipulator, a bully. But Karen wasn't done. The next day, Ethan woke up to an animal control officer at his door. The officer, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes, looked almost apologetic as he checked his clipboard. "We received multiple reports that you have an aggressive, dangerous dog on the premises." Ethan blinked. "What?" He glanced down at Buddy, his 12-year-old golden retriever, who was currently asleep on the porch, snoring. The officer frowned. "Are you Ethan Carter?" "Yeah." "And that's Buddy?" Ethan scratched his head. "Unless I've been feeding an imposter for the past 12 years. The officer sighed. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but we had several complaints about a large, aggressive dog roaming the neighborhood." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Let me guess. All the complaints came from one person." The officer hesitated, then nodded. Ms. Whitmore." "Of course." Ethan forced himself to breathe slowly, to keep his expression neutral, even as rage simmered beneath his skin. He gestured toward Buddy, who had now rolled onto his back, legs in the air, completely dead to the world. "Does that look like a dangerous animal to you?" The officer looked at Buddy. Buddy farted. Loudly. The man let out a long breath. "Yeah, this is ridiculous." Ethan folded his arms. "So, what now?" "Well, I'll be filing a report stating that this was a false claim. If we get another one, Karen could face consequences for filing fraudulent reports." Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. "You might want to clear your schedule. I have a feeling she'll be making another call real soon." Karen had tried to have his dock removed. She had bullied a neighbor into committing a crime. And now she had come after his dog. It was war. That night, Ethan did what he should have done earlier. He called up his lawyer friend and had a cease and desist letter drafted. The HOA was officially barred from interfering with his property. The next morning, he went to Silverwood Lakes Community Board and posted a new sign on his dock. "Private property, Carter Lake. Lake access granted at owner's discretion." No HOA jurisdiction. Karen appeared exactly 7 minutes later, eyes wide, hands shaking. "You can't do this," she stammered. "Oh, Karen," Ethan said, grinning. "I already did." And then, for good measure, he nodded toward the motion-activated sprinkler system he had just installed. Before she could react, a high-pressure jet of ice-cold lake water blasted her straight in the face. She shrieked, stumbling backward, arms flailing. Ethan crossed his arms, watching as she sputtered, her expensive windbreaker soaked through. "This," she choked out, "is harassment." Ethan shrugged. "This is me enforcing my lake rules." Karen's face twisted in fury, but she knew she had no argument. "Not legally. Not now." She stormed off, dripping wet, but Ethan knew she wasn't done. The next time she came back, she wouldn't be alone. Ethan knew Karen wouldn't accept defeat easily, but he hadn't expected her to sink even lower than she already had. He woke up the next morning to an email from his lawyer with a subject line that made his stomach drop. "Urgent, HOA trying to challenge your homeownership." The email detailed a new complaint filed by the HOA with the county zoning office, claiming that Ethan's property was built on protected wetlands and that his purchase might have been illegally approved. If true, his house could be deemed non-compliant, and in the worst-case scenario, he could be forced to move out. Ethan sat back in his chair, gripping his coffee mug so tightly that his knuckles turned white. She wouldn't, he thought. But then again, she absolutely would. She was trying to weaponize the county against him. Instead of wasting time confronting Karen, Ethan drove straight to the county records office. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with the kind of no-nonsense attitude that suggested she had dealt with HOA lunatics before, raised an eyebrow as she read the claim. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "Your property deed is clear. No wetlands designation. The zoning is perfectly legal." Ethan exhaled, but the relief was short-lived when she added, "But I see someone did submit a complaint review request in your file. Looks like it was sent by a Karen Whitmore?" "Of course." Ethan thanked the clerk and left, shaking his head. Karen was grasping at straws, throwing everything she could at him just to see what might stick. But she wasn't done. That night, well after midnight, Ethan was woken by a loud banging at his front door. Groggy and half-dressed, he stumbled to the entrance and flicked on the porch light. 2 police officers stood outside. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Mr. Carter," one of the officers said. "We received a complaint from a resident who claimed you made a violent threat against her." Ethan stared at them, then let out a humorless laugh. "Let me guess," he said dryly. "Karen Whitmore?" The cops exchanged a glance. Ethan exhaled through his nose, already seeing Karen's next move. If she couldn't use the HOA, if she couldn't use the county, she'd try to use the police to intimidate him. "Officer, I haven't seen Karen since this afternoon, and I have security cameras all over my house," Ethan said. "If you need proof that I never left my property or spoke to her, I can pull up the footage right now." One of the officers nodded. "That would be helpful." Ethan disappeared inside, pulled up the live footage on his phone, and scrolled through the entire evening's timeline. He handed the phone to the officer. "There," Ethan said. "Not once did I leave my house. Not once did I have any interaction with Karen. This is a false report." The cop sighed, rubbing his temple. "Yeah. This isn't the first time we've had to deal with this kind of thing." He glanced at his partner, who simply nodded in agreement. Ethan folded his arms. "So, what happens now?" "Well, we'll file a report, and Karen will get a warning about filing a false complaint. If she does it again, she could be charged with filing a false police report." Ethan smirked. "Oh, you might want to keep a file open. I have a feeling you'll be back." The officers left, and Ethan locked his front door, rubbing his face tiredly. Karen had tried to sabotage his homeownership. Karen had tried to have him arrested. She was getting desperate. Which meant it was time for Ethan to end this. The next morning, he set his final plan into motion. Ethan knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight, but even he wasn't prepared for her next desperate move. She had tried using the HOA, the county zoning office, and even the police to intimidate him. But now, she was about to take things to a whole new level. It started with a legal notice taped to his front door. Ethan frowned as he pulled it off and skimmed the document. A cease and desist order? Filed against him? His jaw clenched. Karen was accusing him of illegally blocking community access to the lake. She had claimed that his ownership deed was fraudulent, and that the lake belonged to the HOA by default since it had always been community-controlled. Ethan let out a slow breath. So this was her final strategy, legal intimidation. But here's where she screwed up. Karen had no actual proof of HOA ownership. She was just banking on the fact that lawsuits were expensive and exhausting, hoping Ethan would back down before it even got to court. Too bad for her, Ethan wasn't that kind of guy. Instead of panicking, he picked up his phone and called his lawyer, who, after laughing for a full 10 seconds, assured him that Karen had no legal standing whatsoever. She's bluffing, his lawyer said. It won't hold up. But if she's willing to lie in an official filing, we might be able to hit her with a counterclaim for harassment and defamation. Ethan grinned. Do it. And just to add a little fuel to the fire, he made a point to drop off a copy of the original property deed at the next HOA meeting. Karen was there, of course, and when she saw him casually hand over the papers, she went stiff as a board. "What is this?" she snapped, snatching them up. Ethan leaned against the table. That's the legally binding document proving I own the lake." Karen's face paled. "No," she muttered, flipping through the pages. This isn't possible." "Oh, it's very possible," Ethan said, smirking. "And since you just falsely claimed otherwise in a legal filing, my lawyer will be in touch about your upcoming defamation case." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. For the first time in weeks, she had nothing to say. And that's when Ethan knew, he had finally won. Or so he thought. That night, his security camera alert went off. Ethan grabbed his phone and pulled up the live feed. A hooded figure was sneaking toward his dock, holding what looked like a crowbar. He sighed. "Really, Karen?" Tapping a button on his phone, he activated the motion-triggered floodlights. The figure froze like a deer in headlights. Then, before they could react, Ethan triggered Phase 2. A jet of ice-cold lake water blasted them square in the chest, knocking them flat on their back. The figure yelped, scrambled to their feet, and took off running, completely drenched. Ethan replayed the footage the next morning and wasn't even remotely surprised to recognize the culprit. Dylan Whitmore. Karen's nephew. Ethan wasted no time. He sent the footage straight to the newly reformed HOA board, who had already been 1 foot out the door with Karen anyway. By noon, Karen received a formal violation notice. Her own HOA had turned against her. Vandalism. Trespassing. Property destruction. The irony? The very rules she had once used against everyone else were now being used against her. And just like that, the board voted to remove her from all HOA decision-making. She had lost. Completely. But Karen? She wasn't one to accept reality easily. Which was why, 2 days later, Ethan wasn't at all surprised to see a moving truck pull into her driveway. And he wasn't surprised when she made one final trip down to his dock, just to get in one last word. The morning Karen officially moved out of Silverwood Lake, Ethan made himself an extra cup of coffee and settled onto his dock, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of victory. He had won, not just against her, but against the relentless HOA dictatorship she had spent years building. For the first time in ages, the lake felt like it actually belonged to the community, not just to Karen's ridiculous rules. Families had already started enjoying the new public access, kids skipping rocks, people fishing without fear of a nasty letter arriving in their mailbox. The oppressive shadow of Karen's reign had lifted, and the entire neighborhood felt lighter because of it. But Karen, of course, wasn't one to leave quietly. Ethan watched as she stood by her car, arms crossed, staring out at the lake like it had personally betrayed her. She had fought tooth and nail to control this neighborhood, and now she had nothing. Her house had sat on the market for weeks, but her reputation had made selling difficult. No one wanted to move into the former dictator's den. Finally, as if she couldn't leave without having the last word, she turned and stormed down the dock, stopping just short of where Ethan sat, coffee in hand. "Well," she said, her voice tight. "I hope you're happy." Ethan took a slow sip, completely unbothered. "Oh, I am. Extremely." Karen scoffed. "This community had standards, you know. Just because you waltzed in and tricked people into thinking you own this lake doesn't mean you belong here." Ethan smirked. "That's funny, because about 50 of our neighbors seem to disagree." Karen's eye twitched. "Enjoy your little kingdom," she sneered. "You've ruined this neighborhood." Ethan leaned back, stretching lazily. "That's interesting, because Doug from the HOA told me just the other day that home values actually went up after you resigned." Karen's face turned red. She opened her mouth, no doubt ready to launch into one last tirade, but just then, one of the neighborhood kids threw a rock into the water, sending up a massive splash that soaked the hem of her designer pants. The kid froze in horror. "Ethan?" He nearly choked on his laughter. Karen let out an indignant screech, spun on her heel, and stomped away, her wet shoes squelching with every furious step. She yanked open her car door, slammed it shut, and peeled out of the driveway with all the grace of a cartoon villain making her final exit. The dock erupted into quiet cheers. Karen Whitmore was officially gone. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board worked to undo the mess she had created. Ridiculous regulations were overturned, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood actually felt like a community. The first ever Silverwood Lake Festival was held, complete with barbecue pits, fishing tournaments, and a movie projected onto a floating screen at sunset. Ethan sat back, watching as people swam, laughed, and enjoyed the lake, his lake. A neighbor wandered up beside him. "You know," the man said, chuckling, "you could probably run for HOA president after all this." Ethan nearly spit out his beer. "Yeah, that's a hard pass." The man laughed. "Fair enough. But seriously, you did good, Carter." Ethan nodded, looking out over the water, where the last remnants of the sunset reflected off the calm, peaceful lake. "Yeah. He did. What would you do if you suddenly found out you owned an entire lake? Would you fight back against a power-hungry HOA, or would you take the petty revenge route? Have you ever dealt with a Karen like this? Share your stories below, I'd love to hear them.